Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dennis Boers, Sea Change Team Leader, and I would like to welcome all of you to the 7th Sea Change webinar, and this is the 4th one in our 2012 series. Welcome to all of you attendees who already logged in. We had an enormous interest in this webinar. We had actually over 200 registrants. Which is because, of course, the topic is popular, but I also have a slight feeling it might be that some people didn't really get the time zone correct. But to all of you who are already here, a warm welcome, and also a warm welcome to our presenter of today, Mr. Stephen Tyler of ISET, the Institute of Social and Environmental Transition, who I will introduce in a moment. I also would like to welcome Ms. Sang Lee King as part of the panel who works for Sea Change on the webinar development. This webinar is organized in collaboration with both ISET and ACERN, and I will take a moment to introduce to you both organizations. ISET, the Institute of Social and Environmental Transition, works on understanding social and environmental change processes, including climate change and urbanization, and supporting adaptive responses to the fundamental challenges such processes pose for society and marginalized populations. Their work brings together basic theoretical and scientific information from research, local knowledge, and shared learning to catalyze both practical changes at the local level and the growth of applied knowledge. Adaptation and resilience to climate change is one of the themes ISET's work currently focuses on. ACERN is the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network. It's financially supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, and it is a network of 10 cities in India, Indonesia, Thailand and Vietnam, experimenting with a range of activities that will collectively improve the ability of the cities to withstand, to prepare for, and to recover from the projected impacts of climate change. The approaches taken are determined by the local needs and priorities of each city. This webinar is based on a collaboration between ISET and ACERN, under which a conceptual and operational framework has been designed for urban climate resilience planning. And the question for this webinar is whether climate resilience is perhaps a simpler way to approach adaptation practice. Sea Change, some of the attendants this afternoon are perhaps already Sea Change members and already know about us. But for those of you who are new to Sea Change, I would like to explain that we are a community of practice with currently 240 members that develops a culture of high quality and rigorous M&E frameworks, approaches and methodologies for adaptive responses to climate change interventions and practices in Southeast Asia and beyond. Webinars are one way in which we share knowledge to improve M&E practices related to climate change, but next to webinars we also send out a weekly newsletter, maintain a resource library, we support our members in speaking engagement at conferences, and we support our members in publishing their work. This webinar is as such one of the tools that we use to get the message abroad. For more information on any of these three organizations, go to the websites www.acern.org, www.seachangecop.org, and www.iset with dashes in between.org. A little bit of logistics information for this webinar session. The webinar presentation will take 30 minutes, after which there will be time for questions and answers. You can type your questions in the question field in the software, after which we will present the questions to our presenter, Mr. Steven Tyler. Or you can raise your hand and ask a question verbally. And on the next slide I will show you where you can find the question field and the hand raising button. Any questions that have not been answered during the 40-minute Q&A session will be answered offline and published later on our website, together with a recording of this webinar. We will send out an email later on once the recording has been put online. This is where you will find the raise hand button, and this is where you can simply type the question you are having. And as said, any questions that are not answered will be answered later on. And as a last part of this introduction, let me now introduce to you our presenter of today, Mr. Steven Tyler, Senior Associate with ISET. Steven Tyler, Senior Associate with ISET, the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition, has offices in Bangkok, Hanoi and New Delhi. And I met Steven in March at the Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum in Bangkok. He has more than 20 years experience working in Asia, holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and is based normally in Victoria, working on climate change adaptation projects in Canada and Southeast Asia. But my feeling is that he's mostly traveling. Apart from his lengthy experience and strong academic background, I would say that Steven is someone who is proactive and passionate when it comes to get the climate adaptation and resilience message out there. And it was a pleasure meeting with him in Bangkok and planting the seed for this webinar. I'll be handing over to Steven in a short moment. Steven, given that you make use of Prezi to present, I will tell you when the slide has completely appeared for the first 3 slides, for you to know whether there is a lag in slide transition. And I'll be now handing over to you.
Thank you, Dennis. Okay, so here we are, and you should see my presentation screen now.
That's there, yes.
Great. So welcome everybody, and good morning for all of you who are in Asia. And thank you, Dennis, for the introductions. That saves me having to do that. Just a word about my collaborator, Mars Munch. He's the director of ISET, and that organization works, it's a nonprofit group that works in applied research and collaborative innovation with local organizations both in North America and in Asia. I also want to acknowledge the contributions made to this conceptual development by ARUP International Development, who were particularly useful in helping us clarify some of our ideas on the systems side. And with that, I will plunge right in to the question of the day, and I've just changed, Dennis.
Mm-hmm. And it's full screen now.
So, good. Thank you. So I've got a couple of seconds of lag that I'll try and keep in mind. When we're planning for adaptation measures, we need an approach that can address the complexities of vulnerability and adaptation, but at the same time it has to be simple enough for local practitioners to apply in their own context. So the work on this conceptual framework was undertaken as part of ACERN, as Dennis has said, and is now being implemented not only in the 10 ACERN cities, but in 4 additional cities in the Mekong Building Resilient Asian Cities project, which is funded by USAID. So I want to acknowledge both of those funders for this work. To start with, we're going to look at a typical sort of conceptual planning framework. which you should see up on your screen now.
Yeah, it's visible.
For how we address adaptation. And the problem is normally framed as one based in science, in the science of climate change, and that we develop our plans based on projections of future climate and then the impacts that future climate is likely to have on whatever local area we're working in, whereupon we assess the vulnerability of the people and the systems in that area to the future climate, and we design adaptation actions then to match those and to counteract those impacts. So this is logically consistent and perfectly reasonable approach to thinking about planning for adaptation. But when we get into this and we start working on it, we can see right away that there are some challenges. So first off, starting with the climate data. Very often in anywhere really, there are challenges obtaining climate data and then interpreting what it means. Part of this has to do with the way that the data is framed, but part of it also has to do with the fact that there are irresolvable uncertainties in climate models, and each model is a little bit different, so you need to have results from an ensemble of different models. When you try and take those global climate models and downscale them to the local level so that you can get results that are a bit finer grain, not at the 100 kilometer or 200 kilometer grid scale of the global model, then that increases the uncertainties built into the models. The other problem is that when we're thinking about adaptation planning, we're typically more interested in those extreme values, those high intensity precipitation events or droughts. But climate data is typically presented and summarized as mean values. And finally, when we think about future climate, by looking at future projections, there's a tendency to pick a particular point in time as representing the new normal that we're adjusting to. But of course, that's not what's happening. What's happening is over time, the climate is changing more and more quickly. Climate change is accelerating as long as our greenhouse gas emissions continue. So we're not aiming for some future point in time. We're aiming for a situation that is increasingly dynamic. We find also when we move then from climate data to climate impacts, how will this affect the local area, that climate impacts, climate factors act in combination with other factors. And an analysis that focuses on just direct climate impacts rather than systemic problems may miss some factors. So for example, if you look at this picture, it should be coming up on your screen now, you can see that we have development outside a city in Vietnam that is filling in rice paddies. So if we can expect a higher rainfall and perhaps more extreme flooding events, this area may be safe because it's just been filled by 2 or 3 meters of sand, but the water is going to go someplace. And so somebody is going to be exposed to deeper, faster running water as a result of this development pattern. Now, where does the blame for that lie? Is that a function of climate change? Is that a function of the particular development approach that's being used here? These factors interact, and it's difficult to try and separate the practices from the impacts of climate. Another issue with this sort of linear approach to adaptation is that, not always, but you can tend to get a kind of predict the problem and then intervene to prevent it, which can prevent you from actually accommodating changes that are inevitable, such as sea level rise, for example? Do you put up a dike or do you start moving inland? Adaptation also tends to result in a sort of a project intervention focus this way. You focus on an impact, then you design a project to respond to it. Whereas, in fact, most adaptation is likely to be autonomous. It's likely to be private sector and farmers and local people responding. And the question is, how can we better enable those responses? And another issue is that this linear approach to adaptation may not focus on learning in a systematic way. Finally, particularly for the Sea Change members and audience, there are some real issues of measurement and monitoring of adaptation when you can only test the effectiveness of your strategy at some point in the future when it's exposed to a new level of extreme event. For example, if you are to consider a dike, you can measure the height of the dike, but you can't always predict whether that height is going to be sufficient, or in fact whether the dike itself, by protecting people behind the dike, creates a false sense of security and exposes them to larger catastrophe later on. So these are, in some ways, these are issues that are built into the dilemma of adaptation. It's a challenging problem, and many of these things are not easily resolved. So what we've tried to do with our framework is to build it instead of adapting to some specific future climate. We want to encourage our partners to think about building resilience, where resilience is the capability of a system to maintain or quickly restore its function. Now, I have to emphasize that this definition of resilience does not mean that a system is rigid or static. Far from it. The system has to change to accommodate unexpected events and shocks in order to continue to function effectively. And that's what we mean by resilience. So we have designed, together with our partners, this climate resilience planning framework as a tool to help remind us of what we should consider when we are building resilience to climate change. And the urban part I'll explain in a minute, but I think most aspects of this approach apply equally in urban or rural areas. On the bottom of the diagram, you can see the inputs to the process, which are local knowledge and scientific knowledge. And we have found that it helps to have a facilitator or catalytic agent. Starting with the left-hand loop here, which is understanding vulnerability, you can see that there are 4 key components. The exposure to climate is important. Obviously, if there's no exposure to climate, then you're not going to be vulnerable. So a highland area is not vulnerable to sea level rise, for example. And areas in the temperate and subtropical zones are not generally exposed to tropical storms. So that's the starting point. What is the nature of the climate and what are your climate hazards? But there's 3 key components here to consider. And we'll look at them each in turn. Firstly, systems that include both infrastructure and ecosystems. And in cities, infrastructure is particularly important because it's essential to support high densities of urban living and urban interaction.
Stephen?
Yes.
Can I ask you to speak up a little bit?
Yeah.
I get a request from some attendees to increase the volume.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're talking about systems as a key component then of the resilience framework. And they can be ecosystems or infrastructure systems. And both of these are relevant in both urban and rural areas. But in urban areas, obviously, we have more infrastructure. And in rural areas, we have a more direct reliance on ecosystems. When we think about systems, what we want systems to be in order to be resilient is, first of all, flexible and diverse. We want a system that can meet service needs or deliver ecosystem services under a wide range of climate conditions. Key elements may be spatially distributed, for example. We also want systems to be modular and to have redundancy. So there's spare capacity to accommodate unexpected service demand or extreme events. And similarly, we want systems to be designed to fail in a predictable way, so that if one part of the system is unable to cope with a particular climate event, that does not lead to the collapse of the whole system. When we think of systems, it's important to think particularly of these core systems. These are the ones that support all the other activities that we rely on. So ecosystems, land, energy, water, food supply, shelter, transport, communications. These are the core systems, whether you're in urban or rural areas, that support all the other activity. And those are the ones that we need to pay particular attention to. Let's think of some examples here. This is a flood shelter, which displays characteristics of flexibility and diversity. It can be used for multiple purposes. It can be located in different spatial areas. It's modular. You can have multiple shelters in different places, multiple types of shelter. This is a water supply for the city of Queen Yan, but it's only one of multiple water supplies that they have. They have different sources for water. And by virtue of having different sources, they have a more resilient system. So moving on now to another element that's important in resilience, and that's agents. Those are people, organizations, households, social groups that make decisions. Agency is about decision making, and these are the actors in society. In order to be resilient, these actors have to have certain capacities. They have to be responsive, which means they need to be motivated and able to take timely action when required, including changes in organizational structure. They should be resourceful so that when they identify priority actions for adaptation, they have the necessary financial or other resources to be able to put them into place and implement them. So another way of thinking about resourcefulness is a familiar livelihoods framework, where you have 5 different kinds of assets. And all of these different assets contribute to your the resources that you have at hand and to your livelihoods. Whoops, let's just go back there. I missed one. And that is the very important one, the capacity to learn. This means that agents can identify and anticipate problems, and that lessons from past failures and feedback are internalized in system improvements. So these are the characteristics we look for in agents. And finally, institutions. Institutions are the rules, the norms, the practices by which we behave, we take practical actions. And in this case, we're talking about institutions that link agents and key systems. They constrain or enable access by agents to those systems. The key factors here are that how do we want these institutions to behave? We particularly want to avoid situations of systematic exclusion of specific social groups from access to critical systems, or limitations on their capacities. So, for example, in some places there are limits to who can get access to water supply in a city. You have to have formal land tenure or a title certificate, or you may have to if you don't have formal land tenure, then you are reduced to only informal access to water supply or electricity or whatever the service might be. Similar issues apply to land tenure in rural areas. The second key institutional aspect that will enable access to systems is the decision-making processes, which should be transparent, representative, and accountable. Diverse stakeholders should have ways to provide meaningful input to decisions. Information is also crucial in institutions because decision makers require information in order to be able to determine effective autonomous adaptation actions. This is what we were discussing before. And finally, institutions should be adaptable or flexible in that when presented with evidence of the need to change, they have to be able to be modified. So these are then all the factors that go into understanding vulnerability: climate exposure, systems, ecosystems and infrastructure, the capacity of agents who make decisions, and the nature of institutions that link them. So you can see, for example, many organizations take an approach in development and adaptation that focuses on issues of poverty. So the framework addresses this in two ways. It addresses the capacity of the agents. Do they have the ability to take action either with their own resources or through resources they leverage elsewhere? And through the institutional question, are they marginalized systematically by institutions in society? Do they have access to governance in the sense of having their voices heard and represented in decision making? And is there public access to information? So you can see that most of the factors that we might want to analyze about a local context can be addressed in one of these three categories. And it doesn't matter where you start. You can work on the ones that you're most familiar with as a starting point, as long as you get to all of them. And now, in our view, having introduced this framework and tried it in a number of places, we have found that people, once they can focus on what they're familiar with, they get comfortable with this quite quickly. And so the water engineers will focus on the system aspects, and they'll focus on the capacities and the constraints of their water supply system. The social scientists will focus on agent capacities or on institutions and analyze those. And the key point is they all have to be brought together. And there's no magic formula or calculation for doing that. I think we believe that the best way to do that is through deliberation, through engaging the different sources of knowledge and expertise in a deliberative process that involves discussion and sharing of knowledge and leads to recommendations for action. And this is a process that's iterative. Over time, by sharing knowledge and learning, the collective learning increases. So this then is the understanding vulnerability side of the framework, driven by a shared learning process, a deliberative process. And that then feeds into the implementation side of the process, which is driven by this sort of standard planning framework, these blue arrows around the outside, of identifying actions, prioritizing according to objectives and values, designing interventions, implementing and monitoring the outcomes. All of this driven, this interior part, just a reminder, what we're trying to aim for here is responsiveness, resourcefulness, and learning capacity of agents, and the flexibility, redundancy, and safe failure of systems. All of that mediated by institutions of decision-making, information, access or marginalization, prevention of access, and adaptability. So it's just kind of a reminder then of the components that we're trying to maximize here, using this planning cycle illustrated around the outside. So we've implemented this process with partners in a number of cities. And in the 10 eastern cities at least, the cities themselves, our local partners, have come up with some resilience plans. What we found is that, as I was explaining earlier, the local partners can grasp and emphasize the elements that are that they're most familiar with. And by interacting with each other, they can sort out a wide range of possible interventions and choose priorities. So in the 10 city resilience plans in ACER, the cities came up not only with infrastructure interventions, infrastructure measures that they wanted to implement, but also ecosystem enhancement measures, capacity building measures for individuals, households, and organizations, and institutional measures, such as the rights of changes in the rights of individuals to access water supply or to access ecosystem resources. Many of them suggested no regrets measures to start with. That is, measures that would provide benefits regardless of the details of future climate conditions, such as ameliorating or expanding water supply, or improving sanitation. Many of them suggested undertaking studies of more costly measures prior to committing to implementing them, which is a sensible strategy under uncertainty. They also recommended an improvement of awareness and skills, and they suggested setting up new planning and coordination agencies, an institutional measure. The other thing that the framework helps us with is that it creates the opportunity for us to define and then collect data on indicators of this resilience. By framing resilience in relation to these three key elements, we can actually measure changes in them. And if the purpose of resilience indicators is local planning, then what we want is for those indicators to be simple, measurable, obviously actionable, so that local action by government or the community would result in changes to those indicators. They have to be relevant to the issue of resilience. In other words, the indicators clearly have to link back to changes in resilience of the systems, agents, or institutions. And they have to be dynamic in the sense that they have to change fairly quickly in order that when we monitor them, we can see the difference. Finally, they should be cost-effective, so largely based on existing data, and locally owned, which means that the indicators were not designed by external experts. They were not designed for purposes of standardized comparison. The indicators are locally designed by cities who have different priorities and different adaptation issues. And so each city, we helped develop a tool for each of the cities in ACERN to design their own indicators. And I think you can see how by extension you could apply this tool in a wide range of settings. So this is the tool we designed, and it's just an illustration here for the water supply sector. It's a spreadsheet which should be read from left to right and from top to bottom. What the different columns are first, on the left-hand side, the desired outcomes for urban climate resilience. And then the vulnerability of the particular local area. What is that city or that area's main sources of vulnerability in relation to this sector, water supply? A series of key questions that come out of that vulnerability, and then potential indicators that would measure the results of those questions. And these will depend very much on what kind of data is available and what kind of questions local partners come up with. So we read this then from left, where we're talking about systems here, and the characteristics of systems, flexibility and diversity. Whoops. Need to get closer, not farther away. Flexibility and diversity, redundancy, modularity, safe failure. What do those mean? How do we interpret that in terms of the vulnerability of this particular system in this particular place? And then what are the options, and what kind of questions would we ask in relation to these resilience characteristics? So by working their way through this spreadsheet, the partners come up with their own list of potential indicators, and then they collect data on them. So you can do this also for agents in terms of responsiveness, their ability to reorganize, resourcefulness, capacity to learn, and also for the institutional factors as well at the bottom. In each case, the logic is the same. You have the definition of what you're trying to achieve on the left-hand side, some vulnerability information that is locally specific. That comes from local assessments of key climate issues that may be current issues or future issues if they have some assessment of future climate impacts. And then you ask questions about that and identify potential indicators that would help you answer those questions. So this process has been followed in the 10 ACERN cities, and they've come up with their own indicators. So this is just a sample of the kinds of indicators of resilience that they have come up with in different sectors. So some of them chose to look at water supply, others looked at public health, some were concerned about the health of mangrove areas on the fringes of the city, which were key to protecting the city's shoreline from storms and from flooding. So these are some of the indicators they came up with for the basic systems. You can see in water supply, they had the capacity of the source over 10-year projected demand, or it could be treatment plant, leakage rate in the distribution system, number of days per year that supply failed. And so they have available data on this, and by demonstrating changes in that data over time, they demonstrate changes in resilience. Similarly for public health, the sort of preventive health budget as a percent of sector spending, number of clinics or hospitals flooded over a 5-year period, hospital beds perhaps, and the number of households who are undertaking some precautionary measures, such as mosquito control. Again, in terms of agent capacities, we have here under mangroves the formation of community management groups, participants in trainings for mangrove seedling nurseries, the number of annual violations of forest protection rules, which demonstrate the capacity of organizations and local management groups to enforce and manage those rules. And then as institutions, the question of water tariffs, how many people does this exclude, service eligibility requirements, the availability of public information on water quality, and so on. So I think you get the point. The indicators are quite diverse, and they can respond to community priorities and to available data. So overall then, in summary, a resilience planning framework that is generalizable to a wide range of contexts. It's simple enough to grasp the key points, but flexible enough that local users can get into as much detail and as much an analytical emphasis as they choose to in areas that are of importance to them. So at that point, I will wind down my presentation and welcome questions from the audience.
Stephen, thank you for the presentation, and I also want to ask the audience, the attendees, to come up with their questions regarding this presentation. A first question that I have is, the catalytic agent is basically combining local knowledge and scientific knowledge. Does the catalytic agent also have a role towards the development of indicators and the development of the monitoring part?
Right. Actually, the agent is not doing the combination of the let me just go back to that diagram. The catalytic agent sort of is facilitating the whole process. Local knowledge and scientific knowledge are inputs to the process. The role of the agent is to guide the shared learning process, this iterative shared learning, and to ensure that the diverse participants in resilience planning remember the various elements, so they don't get too hung up on dealing only with the capacity of agents and forget about some of the institutional issues. So that's really, the catalytic agent is a facilitator, and that facilitator could be an NGO, it could be a research organization, It could even be a skilled government agency. And so they could have a role in helping to develop the indicators in the same way that they would want to assist local partners to remember the diverse elements and the criteria that they're trying to meet with those indicators.
Okay. Another question that comes to mind, and I'm still waiting for questions from the attendees actually, is what is still seen as resilient? Because I see those indicators, and I'm thinking, when are we still talking about resilience? What should be the outcome? Is the threshold also set by the local people?
Right. That's right. That's a good point. In each of these cases, the question is how much is enough, or is for example, if we look at a leakage rate for water supply, well, even in a very developed and wealthy country, there will be a certain amount of leakage in your water distribution system. So what's a suitable rate, and what would you regard as a very good rate? What's a bad rate? What's a good rate? Those judgments have to be made by the local experts in each case. And so the next step in terms of developing indicators is to develop a rank score for each indicator on a simple scale, where the low and high points are determined by local experts, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that means that the threshold where you still talk about resilience can be completely different from one city to the next for a comparable implementation.
Different cities could take the same indicator and have different target levels of it, yes.
Okay. I got a question here from Jiwant from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He says, the urban climate change resilient framework seems to be wonderful, but he's curious regarding its implementation in practice in participating cities. Do these cities really practice it? Do you have examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is we've been impressed by how much the cities have taken this on board. And to give you some examples, the cities are framing their own work in terms of resilience now more than adaptation. And one good example would be in the water supply company in Da Nang, which is not our primary partner. We work primarily there with a different government agency who we've worked with for about 2 years. And it takes some time for local partners to work through the concepts and to operationalize them in their own terms. It would be much easier for us as outside experts to just come in and develop a plan and then leave them with a nice shiny report, but it likely wouldn't go very far. So they work through the implications themselves, and in the case of Da Nang in Vietnam, the local water supply company has enthusiastically embraced this process and is now very much on board in terms of developing and using the indicators for resilience so that they can improve their long-term climate resilience. That's part of a deliberate corporate plan.
I hope that answers your question, Jiwant. Another question that comes in is from John Rainbird from Australia. And he says, is there a risk in this approach that some systems which really need to be changed or transformed are in fact made more resilient to change?
Right. I think if you just focused on the systems, then let me go forward here to that diagram again. That would be a risk. I think the balancing factor here is that by looking at institutions and at agents, you can get at those systems that are dysfunctional or leading to problems. For example, systems of resource tenure in rural areas that lead to concentration of land holdings in private hands for purposes of growing cash crops or plantation, industrial plantation agriculture. Well, this system may lead to not only degradation of the biodiversity, but also to exposure of the agents through diminished livelihood opportunities. And so by using these different approaches, institutions, agents, and systems, I think you can get at that tendency for systems to resist change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. John, I hope that answers your question. If not, let me know. A question I have has to do with the fact that this framework has been developed for urban climate resilience planning. So there are two words, that is urban and that is planning. How applicable would this be if you're not in an urban setting and if it's not about planning?
The framework is always about planning, I think. It's about trying to decide what kind of adaptation measures you should do and how do you get started, and then how would you monitor and measure change. So in that sense, it's always going to be about planning and implementation as well, once you've done the planning. We do use the same concepts in ISET work in rural areas in Nepal, where we've also looked at the climate resilience of food systems. And we find that the concepts are readily transferable. As I was saying earlier, the difference is that in a city, you tend to emphasize, when you think of systems, you tend to emphasize the infrastructure, the distribution networks for electricity, for water supply, for transport, the built environment that supports such a high density of economic activity and interaction. In rural areas, you tend to think of the ecosystems, the watersheds, the way that those support irrigation systems, the soil quality, the way that farmers interact with those natural systems. But both factors are important in both places. So in cities, ecosystems are also important. Ecosystems are important in stabilizing and buffering flood areas. In watersheds are very important in hydrological mediation. And ecosystems, of course, supply the food for cities. Ecosystems that are far away. And similarly in rural areas, key infrastructure like energy, like transport, access to markets, really plays a big role in determining rural resilience. So I think the general framework applies in both areas.
Okay, that's very clear. Jiwant had an observation himself after your previous answer on his question, and he says, I visited some of these cities and talked with people working in the urban planning area, and their conclusion was that limitations are mainly institutional when it comes to the implementation of any climate change resilience or adaptation policy. And the feeling is that implementation is still very project specific and not really based on a wider strategy. What's your feeling about this observation?
I think that's true. and we're trying to move people away from that by giving them the tools to think more strategically about the issues, but also to recognize that a great deal of climate adaptation will be autonomous. It will be undertaken not by the government, not driven by some well-coordinated, carefully planned and implemented strategy, but by increasing awareness and better information about climate risks and hazards to the population. And we can see in these cities how some of that is starting to happen. For example, there is increasing public awareness that the risks of flooding, I showed you that example, the picture of the fill going into the rice paddies. And local people are acutely aware that their exposure to flooding is changing as a result of this urban development pattern. And that is creating some behavioral changes, but it's also creating some political pressure on the government. And so I think there will be, what we need is better tools for local planning agencies who tend to be, as usual, siloed into different compartments. So the planners don't talk to the hydrologists, who don't talk to the emergency response people who deal with the flooding and so on. They all have their own technical expertise and narrow specialist function. And by giving them these tools to see how these pieces break together, I think we can help overcome some of those institutional barriers.
A question from Srikant Meza is, you have discussed the importance to predict and prevent. Can you give a short explanation of a case study in which you have predicted and the step taken to ensure the climate resilience?
I mentioned predict and prevent actually as a potential problem because if you focus on predicting and then preventing adverse responses, you can fall into this trap of perpetuating situations that will have to ultimately change. So a predict and prevent response would be predicting sea level rise and building a dike. And that, that isn't always the best response to sea level rise. And you want to be able to think about other strategic options and how that your choices are affected by building resilience both of agents and of institutions as well. I'm trying to think of a case here. One example, for example, would be in terms of the impact of changing hydrological conditions on a densely developed city. And the challenge it's very difficult to do predict and prevent in a case like that, actually, because you have to be able to not only anticipate the changes in the river flow or the hydrology, but also changes in the urban structure and form, and then changes possibly in the upstream management of reservoirs and dams on that river. And it's rare to find an institutional structure that allows you to sort of control and manage all of those things. So you can try to build higher dikes or physical structures, but in the end be overcome by some of these other compounding factors.
Another question is from Caroline Bochard, and she says, looking at the indicators, they currently look like indicators for normal development. Can you explain a little more how climate information is brought in? Especially as some of these indicators are quite dynamic. For example, on water supply in urban areas, this will constantly change anyway with urbanization. How can you make sure they incorporate the changing needs under climate change?
Right. I think in the short term, that's actually the issue here is that the changing needs driven by long-term climate changes are not going to be easily captured in short-term interventions. So I think it's a fair observation that these indicators actually look a lot like development indicators. And I don't think that's a big problem because it's how they're being used that's important. I think the context in which the local planners are looking at these things is that they're trying to build a resilience of their systems. Now, they're thinking about climate change, and they're particularly thinking about exposure to certain kinds of climate risk, perhaps drought in the case of water supply, or perhaps salinization if they're close to the coast. But it's true that if these indicators change in a positive way, they're also becoming resilient to lots of other things too. They're developing. So the difference between just a broad sort of measure of development and a climate resilience indicator, I think, is partly that they are targeting certain kinds of vulnerabilities, and partly that they are they're looking for short-term changes in things that are going to be lead to a positive long-term climate effect, that is a climate resilience effect in the long term. So it really has to do more with their objectives and the kinds of vulnerabilities they're looking at. Mm-hmm. But the indicators themselves, I agree, would be quite similar.
Yeah, yeah. We're going to the last questions now. A statement from G1. He says, I totally agree with Dr. Tyler. My worry is about the time frame of realization among these cities. By observing the current urban expansion rate within the next few years, it will be a huge challenge among them to conduct any adaptation or resilience-related planning. What's your feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, in general, it will be challenging to, often in many of these cities, we can see that current trends are actually exacerbating the problem. That is, they are leading to less resilience rather than more, mm-hmm. because they are creating new risks. And it will take some time to turn that around, I agree. Mm-hmm. I think the positive thing is that there has been a pretty good response at the executive levels in all of the cities that we've worked with. And, you know, the local government is not monolithic. And so within local government in all the places that we've worked, there are groups who get this and are concerned, and there are other groups who are more interested in sort of business as usual and you know, rapid development and not worrying about the future so much. Mm-hmm. So that dynamic plays out a little bit differently everywhere, but I think it is in play, and things will change.
Yeah, yeah. A last question is from John Rainbird, and that's actually a pretty good one. Do you see the use of scenario planning as a useful tool linking to this approach? And I have to agree with him, because quite some complex problems are better understood when scenario planning is being used.
Yes, and several of the cities do use scenario planning. And it's useful in several ways. It's useful to provide some boundaries for considering how not only climate is changing in future, but or the city itself, the urban development is changing, and these places are changing rapidly. So you can set some bounds on plausible alternative conditions. But it's also very helpful even as you get into more technical modeling work that might flow out of this. So from a consideration of some vulnerability issues, a planning group in a rural or an urban area may look at and say, really our biggest threat is loss of groundwater due to falling water table due to over-extraction and drought and consistent drought. So at that point, scenarios become very useful in looking at the implications of alternative strategies for responding to that.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you for the whole presentation. A last question I got had to do with whether people can get the presentation and the recording of this webinar. The answer is yes. We will put the recording of this webinar online in the coming days and send out an email to everyone who registered for this webinar. The presentation itself is done in Prezi, which is an online tool and which is a bit harder to share, but we will share the framework that's available online and also the report on catalyzing urban climate resilience, which explains this framework further. Do you have anything to add to that, Stephen?
Yes, I should say to people that ISET is in the process now of developing training materials based on the framework and our experience in applying it. And those should be available in the next couple of months. Probably when the site is available, it'll be at modules, training modules, that is, modules at i-s-e-t.org.
Okay. That's very good to hear, and we will also share that in one of the upcoming newsletters when it becomes available.
Great. We'll let you know then.
Stephen, thank you very much for your time this late evening for you in Canada, and thank you to everyone for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. We will keep everyone posted on new upcoming webinars, and feel free to have a look on the websites of the three organizations who have collaborated here, which is ISET, ACERN, and SeaChange. The emails will also be in the link that will be sent around later on. And Stephen can be emailed on Stephen, S-T-E-P-H-E-N, @iset.org, and it is how do you call that, Stephen? The little dash that needs to be in there?
You can call it a dash.
A dash. So it's Stephen at i-s-e-t.org. That's where you can reach him. Thank you again to everyone. Thank you to you, Stephen. And for everyone, a good day or a good night.